Thank you very much. Thank you. And as you'll see, some of the topic that I will tackle here will be have already been addressed earlier today. So I think it's very interesting. But I'll address them in a certain way so that it will not be so repetitive. Okay, so I'll begin. As we saw earlier, so if for Hegel nature reveals itself as the Andersein of the idea, at the other end of the spectrum, this it also represents the alterity that spirit must supersede in to assert its own freedom. And that relation, of course, is usually thought of from an anthropological standpoint or perspective, but I will try to show that this relational structure between nature and subjectivity or consciousness is already at play in some way within nature through the notion of unorganische Natur. So I shall argue that this notion's importance is threefold. It has first an historical importance, in particular as a possible anticipation of Huxley's concept of Umwelt. It has an ethical importance in conferring a certain subjectivity to non-humans animal. And thirdly, it has an exegetical importance in providing the possibility of a naturalistic reading of Hegel. And so my paper will be divided in four parts. The first will describe Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur, and the following section will be more exploratory pertaining to the different types of importance that I've just stated. So I come to my first section. First of all, I just want to clarify one thing. So when I talk of unorganische Natur here, I'm not referring to what is for Hegel in itself inorganic in nature, namely celestial mechanics, physics, or chemical phenomena. That's not my concern. So I refer to the use of the concept as it comes up in the last part of Hegel's philosophy of nature, which pertains to organische physique. And the notion is introduced in paragraph 352 of the encyclopedia. So in this context, the notion is thoroughly relational. It is nature as it appears for a given living being, either human or non-human. The notion of unorganische Natur will play, in fact, an important role in Hegel's account of biological life. And so to understand, I think that we should have in mind Hegel's general account of natural life. So in his nature philosophy, Hegel distinguishes three moments of life: the Gestalt, the Assimilation, and the Gattungsprozess. And so the first moment corresponds broadly to the internal process of self-structuration of the living being as an organic totality, and the second to the external process of objectivation and relation to an environment understood as the living being's other. And the third moment corresponds to the moment of sexual differentiation, where the living being's other is not merely its external environment, but another living being with whom it reaches the concrete universality of the Gattung. So in this later process, reproduction conveys a new meaning in the sense by which it consists not merely in the self-reproduction of the individual through digestion, but the self-reproduction of the universal species through sexuality. So although the sexual partner will unavoidably be part of one's environment, and the Gestaltung will define in part the perceptual faculties, the kind of sentience that will come into play for a given animal in relation to its environment. Hegel's elaboration of the notion of unorganische Natur will essentially take place within the second moment of Assimilation, in which der Organismus ist daher zu betrachten als Idee, die sich zu ihrem anderen ihrer unorganischen Natur verhält und sie ideell in sich setzt. So in this relation to its environment, the living being doesn't lose itself to externality, but on the contrary recaptures the exteriority of nature to make it its own. The external world is not merely a surrounding, but it becomes somewhat of an Umwelt, an environment. Of course, the word Umwelt does not actually appear in Hegel encyclopedia, but I think that the idea behind what he calls the organisms, unorganische Natur, is certainly close, as we shall see, to what will be known after Jacob von Uexküll as the notion of Umwelt. The inorganic nature of the animal is nothing else but the world that it specifically inhabits, which can be defined by the totality of constitutive and meaningful elements with which it interacts, which can trigger its interest and desire. So in this sense, it is always more or less limited. Jedes Tier hat nur einen beschränkten Kreis zu seiner eigenen unorganischen Natur, die allein für es ist und die es sich aus vielem und zwar Vermögen des Instinkt heraussuchen muss. But the trigger of a reaction which belongs to this world is not considered here from a kind of external vantage point of the outside observer, but is more postulated from an immanent standpoint of the living being itself. So it implies, in a sense, contrary to the animal being, a certain subjectivity that is, in fact, far from self-evident from a kind of modern philosophical, that is Cartesian standpoint. So the interaction with one's environment or inorganic nature always relates not only to the perceptual capacities of a given animal, but to the level of consciousness and subjectivity that such capacity allows. So in this sense, the inorganic nature of an organic being exists as something that is both, of course, outside of the living being itself, and only in relation to its very being. So as external to the organic being, this inorganic sphere where the animal may move, act, feed itself is truly a world, but a world that only exists for the animal, a world that surrounds it, and so it's a kind of Umwelt. It is the other, but only the animal owns others. So das Tier, Hegel writes, nicht das andere überhaupt soll erkannt werden, sondern eines jeden sein anderes. In this relation to its inorganic nature, Hegel grants a kind of proto-consciousness to the animal that anticipates consciousness proper. So in his essay on life and autonomy, Thomas Corana makes a similar assertion that animals possess, I quote, a basic form of subjectivity that prefigures the self-productive quality of spirit in decisive respects. The animal exists as self-production in the sense of the production of a self, unquote. But by becoming a conscious self, the animal also initiates a certain relation to its world that can be described in terms of object relation of practical objectives, what Uexküll described as the Funktionskreise. And this will be kind of my focus here. So, the animal fractions space in place of rest, of hunting grounds, perceives object as food or sources of danger. Um, and sorry, uh, and Hegel even seems to grant a certain theoretical ability to certain animals, which relates to their world in some kind of basic inferential ways. So this process, proto-consciousness allows the animal to make of its surrounding something that is of its own, a proper Umwelt. But it also defines the limits of what nature is for this specific animal. And so as such, Hegel incidentally sets kind of the basic outline for the study of animal behavior in psychology in relation to their natural habitats. Of course, Hegel is not really interested in laying out these basic conditions for an empirical study of animal behavior per se, but I think nonetheless that his notion of unorganische Natur does provide an interesting tool for what will later become known as ethology. So I come to my second section on the historical importance. So Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur has had a certain historical posterity, both directly and indirectly. So directly through the Hegelian school, of course, and most notably certain young Hegelians like Feuerbach and Marx, who made use of the concept either implicitly or explicitly. So Ludwig Feuerbach, for example, remains probably, despite himself, a faithful heir to Hegel's philosophy of nature when he speaks of the animal consciousness. And the recuperation of the concept is even clearer in Marx's case. Not only do we have the same explicit terminology, but Hegel's very ideas. Only the focus kind of shifts from Hegel's interest for science or knowledge to Marx's interest for social practices. Both elements are present with both authors, but I think that each kind of insists on one point more than the other. So I quote Marx. Life of the species, both in man and in animal, consists physically in the fact that man, like the animal, lives on inorganic nature. And the more universal man or the animal is, the more universal is the sphere of inorganic nature on which he lives. Just as plants, animals, stones, air, light, etc., constitute theoretically a part of human consciousness, partly as objects of natural science, partly as objects of art, is spiritual inorganic nature, spiritual nourishment, which he must first prepare to make palatable and digestible. So also in the realm of practice, they constitute a part of human life and human activity. Physically, man lives only on these products of nature, whether they appear in the form of food, eating, clothes, dwelling, etc. The universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality which make all nature is inorganic body, both inasmuch as nature is direct means of life, and second, the material, the object, and the instrument of his life activity. So nature is man's inorganic body. Nature, of course, that is insofar as it is not itself the human body. Man lives on nature means that nature is his body, uh, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. So, end of quote. So in many aspects of Marx right here are kind of and already central in Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur. But what is also interesting here is that Marx quote is the kind of terminological transition from Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur to the notion of inorganic body, because, well, this concept will recur in Marx's major work in the Grundrisse, for instance. And so this tends to show that Hegel's concept did not only have an influence on the young Marx, but also maybe on his later work as well. But this kind of direct historical influence will not be my main focus here. So I'll be more interested in the indirect kind of historical importance of Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur as a sort of anticipation, which can be which when translated into Huxley's notion of Umwelt, has had a tremendous impact on the history of ideas in science. So, of course, the first step would then be to determine whether one can, as I suggest, simply translate Hegel's notion into Huxley's. As we shall see, there is strong relation between the two notions, but also limits to the comparison, of course. And to underline it, I shall briefly present Huxley's concept of Umwelt as described in his forays into the world of animal and human. But before I do so, I just found it interesting, although largely anecdotal, that Jacob's great uncle Boris von Uexküll was actually a pupil of Hegel, and that we have still his notebooks on Hegel's philosophy of nature. Of course, I doubt that he had any direct influence on Jacob, who was merely 6 years old, I think, when his great uncle died. So enough an anecdote, but it's just interesting. I'm not the first, of course, to underline the proximity between Hegel's notion of unorganische Natur and Huxley's Umwelt. But naturally, we have to say for ourselves if the comparison sticks. And so I'll briefly consider Huxley's Umweltlehre. So in his foray into the worlds of animal and human, Huxley uses the image of a soap bubble to describe the visual space and more generally the environment of various animals. I quote, "We must imagine all the animals that animate nature around us as having a soap bubble around them, closed on all sides, which closes off their visual space and in which everything visible for the subject is also enclosed. Each bubble shelters other places. In each are also found the directional planes of effective space, which give a solid scaffolding to space. The bird that flutters about, the squirrels hopping from branch to branch, and the cow grazing in the meadow all remains permanently enclosed in the bubble that encloses their space. And more than what is merely visible, the soap bubble that constitutes one's Umwelt encompasses all signifying sorry, elements for a specific animal. Sorry. So outside of this soap bubble, things have simply no meaning for the animal. They do not exist as such, and they can never be perceived within the general frame of reference of the animal. There is, of course, a strong Leibnizian kind of monadological undertone in this description. Each animal lives in its own closed world and can only perceive the other as a set of signs that are part of its own world, and not as living being having a world of its own. There is also a seemingly kind of Berkeleyan undertone to Huxley's conception of the environment. The functional cycle of living being could indeed be described largely as existence is percipi or percipere. The Umwelt of a living being is merely what it perceives and may act upon in return, and the living being only exists insofar as it perceives and the necessary mean or obstacles to its survival, but its environment also exists only to the extent that it is perceived and perceivable. We all seem then to live in kind of different worlds with different frames of reference and scale for Huxley, and these worlds do not truly communicate with each other. Perhaps with the exception of our human world, in which through scientific studies and technological innovation, we can more or less translate or envision what it means to live, think, or feel as a tick, a whale, or a bat. Beside this possible exception, Uxkhul nature seems to be entirely constituted of Leibnizian monad, defined through the perceptual relation between the subject and its environment. And so this is why we must distinguish between Umwelt and Umgebung. The Umgebung is merely what surrounds an animal from an external viewpoint, and the Umwelt, on the contrary, is that which has a significance for an animal, what is it can and must perceive in order to live and survive. And in this regard, the animal is not a mere machine anymore for Uxkhul that would merely react to an external stimulus, but it is rather a machine operator. Use this image. So each living being disposes of a more or less elaborate array of kind of perceptual tools in a broad sense, which allows its survival. But for a proper answer to take place, a prior discrimination among the object must occur. The stimulus has to be gemerkt, noticed by the subject. And this is the essential process of the functional cycle. What is important is the fact that the process of action-reaction kind of implies an act of attention and interpretation. It does imply a form of subjective and proto-conscious behavior. And on this level, I think that Uxkhul and Hegel are largely in agreement. Nonetheless, if Hegel could accept the monadological character of Uxkhul Umwelten for what pertains to animal, he would probably argue that this frontier is superseded by der Mensch als das allgemeine denkende Tier. So as a thinking animal, the human world is not limited to what we can or cannot perceive. The somewhat relativistic dimension of Uxkhul's framework would also, of course, appear problematic for Hegel, with Uxkhul and the relativity of our perception of time and space, for example, in relation to our own Umwelt's frame of reference. We are brought back to a purely phenomenal concept of reality that exists merely for us. We are thus condemned to a merely subjective representation of nature as an inorganic nature or as an Umwelt, which would differ in scope and complexity from a living being to the other. And this would, in a sense, bring us back to what Hegel saw as the limit of Kant's critical philosophy and push these limits even further toward kind of a deadly skepticism. So as we know, Hegel refuses Kant's idea of a noumenal sphere, which he sees as a manifestation of Kant's merely subjective idealism. And on the other hand, however, Hegel also refuses the realist alternative, presenting nature in itself as something immediately given. So in the observing reason section of the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel plainly states the active role of self-conscious reason in the apprehension of nature. But whereas the animal's Umwelt or inorganic nature is nur ein beschränkter Umkreis der allgemeinen unorganischen Natur, a partial view of what nature is as a whole, the human being would be the single living being able to apprehend nature in itself as a whole through consciousness, not merely through perception, but through thought and reason. And this ability to consider nature in itself, with its principles and laws, includes the possibility to consider the world of other animals for what they are in themselves, worlds in themselves with their own frames of perceptual reference. So in other words, through science, the human being is not only able to establish reality as such, rationality of nature, but also how this reality is perceived by different living beings in what is their own Lebenswelt. And this is significant from an ethical standpoint. So I come to my next section. Of course, I do not aim to make of Hegel an advocate for the cause of animal welfare. That would be, first of all, anachronistic, at least to my knowledge in the German idealism context. And it would be also largely foreign to, I think, what is Hegel's general project. Although the animal organism constitutes the summit in the realm of nature for Hegel, Hegel's system and his philosophy of spirit in particular remains grounded on what we would call a speciesist view that grants superiority to the human being. There is, in fact, for Hegel, an unendlicher Unterschied between the human being and the non-human animal, a difference that would rest on the human ability to think, to know, and to produce a proper knowledge, a Wissenschaft, and which is science, in other words. But despite what we would now call a speciesist view, I would nonetheless argue that with the Unorganische Natur, we have a notion that could prove useful for the establishment of a properly Hegelian animal ethics that would neither be the result of a sort of a deconstruction or of an immanent critique, nor incompatible with Hegel's general project, but which would merely draw a single thread out of it in order to embroider something that he had left fallow. So my argument is the following. With the notion of inorganic nature, we have an understanding of the animal not merely as a machine, as in Descartes, but as a subject in control of its environment. And this is what potentially confers a certain dignity to the animal, which commands certain respect potentially. Not a mere admiration for a kind of complex machinery, but a respect toward a subject that embodies not only a level of perfection in adequation to its world, but to a certain extent, a certain level of freedom within nature. So Hegel summarizes the various manifestation of animal subjectivity that entails kind of relative freedom at paragraph 351 of the Encyclopedia. First, its ability to move itself and occupy this or that place. Its voice as Äußerung der Empfindung, der Selbstgefühl. Its capacity to generate heat and its unterbrochene Unterzeption, which both manifest kind of the animal's ability to extract itself from the determinacy of its surroundings and to dissolve it and integrate it into itself. And finally, and more importantly, its sensitive and sensory ability, which allows it to exist even minimally in a world made of objects distinct from each other and distinct from itself. In that regard, as Susanna Lindberg argues, Hegel's emphasis is quite different from Heidegger's, whose conception of the animal was significantly also inspired by Uexküll's work. So that's kind of an interesting meeting point. Heidegger emphasizes on the poverty of the animal's Umwelt. I quote, "The animal is poor in the world, it somehow possesses less, but less of what? Less in respect of what is accessible to it, of whatever as an animal it can deal with, of whatever it can be affected by as an animal, or of whatever it can relate to as a living being. Less as against more, namely as against the richness of all those relationships that human design has at its disposal." So Hegel, Feuerbach, Marx, and Uexküll, they all considered similarly the distinction between the human and non-human animal in terms of higher or lesser complexity of relations, of organization, and so on. But no one drew so clearly, I think, the normative implication of such a fact in terms of richness and poorness. Hegel wrote, for example, at the paragraph 190 of his Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, dass dir einen beschränkten Kreis von Mitteln und Weisen der Befriedigung seiner gleichfalls beschränkten Bedürfnisse. Der Mensch beweist auch in dieser Abhängigkeit zugleich sein Hinausgehen über dieselbe und seine Allgemeinheit. He goes on, es gibt Insekten, die an eine bestimmte Pflanze gebunden sind, andere Tiere, die einen weiteren Kreis haben, in verschiedenen Klimaten leben können, aber es tritt immer ein beschränktes gegen den Kreis ein, welcher für den Menschen ist. But whereas this would kind of tend to show the richness of the human world and the poorness of the animals for Heidegger, for Hegel it rather shows, dass es dem Mensch nicht so bequem hat wie das Tier. Das Bedürfnis der Wohnung und Kleidung, die Notwendigkeit, die Nahrung nicht mehr roh zu lassen, sondern sie sich adäquat zu machen, and the complex social relation wove by the human being are not necessarily sign of a superiority, but rather of a natural incompleteness. And of course, for the emergence of spirit and the kind of superior form of freedom that it conveys, this incompleteness is not only necessary, but actually a good thing. Nonetheless, it applies a very different, I think, normative stance toward the animal in its world. First, even though the human being's natural incompleteness grants a unendlich Bildsamkeit, an infinite plasticity, which make of this kind of natural defect a spiritual asset, the animals are nonetheless considered perfectly adapted to their environment and not benumbed as for Heidegger. Furthermore, the comparatively rich social and cultural relation of human beings do not demean the potentially rich forms of organization and experiences animals may live, and which the human mind can only barely fathom. Consequently, one can adopt very different normative attitudes toward the non-human animal. And that Heideggerian one would more or less resolve around pity and condescension toward the poorness of the animal in terms of world and experience. Another attitude would be to marvel before this kind of functional perfection of their organization. And yet another attitude would be one of respect for what the animal is, namely a subject, having its own will with its own hand, even if they may more or less depend on natural instinct and determinism. Thus, Hegel's notion of animal subjectivity and its unorganische Natur opens the possibility for an ethical relation toward the animal in which its inscription into a world of its own grants it a certain moral dignity for us. But ironically, such a possibility can only exist for Hegel because of the human being's privilege within the animal kingdom, namely our ability to consider the others animals existent as belonging to a world of their own and not merely to a part as a part of our home. So to put it bluntly, it is the human being's privilege to adopt a moral stance toward non-human animal that is not merely grounded on empathy and feeling, but on the respect of animal as ends in themselves. Such a possibility to do right by the animal implies, however, kind of an ontological difference between human and non-human animals. This is, of course, voluntarily controversial, but for the moment, I shall remain at this kind of preliminary exposition of how the concept of inorganic nature in Hegel could be of use for the establishment of a non-utilitarian rationalist animal ethics. So I come to my last section, my final point, namely the exegetical importance of the notion of unorganische Natur for a qualified naturalist interpretation of Hegel. Although Hegel insists on the demarcation between the human and the non-human animals, his very formulation seems to draw a certain continuity between the two. Jedes Tier hat nur einen beschränkten Kreis zu seiner eigenen unorganischen Natur, die allein für es ist. However, der Mensch als das allgemeine denkende Tier hat einen viel ausgedehnteren Kreis und macht sich alle Gegenstände zu seiner unorganischen Natur, auch für sein Wissen. So the difference could appear at first as merely quantitative, just as the caterpillar has a more limited inorganic nature or Umwelt in comparison to the lions, for instance. Likewise, the human being would enjoy within the animal kingdom the most extensive inorganic nature. She would nevertheless remain grounded on this kind of biological, merely natural relation any animal enjoys to its with its own environment. And with the notion of unorganische Natur, we would then have kind of a naturalist notion that could explain for the emergence of human knowledge and consciousness through the human being's relation to our environment. But of course, as we saw earlier, and as we see again in Hegel's quote, the human being unorganische Natur is qualitatively different, at least for Hegel, from any other animals, since it encompasses not only the human being, what human being can perceive and experience, but also what she can think and know. And so, as as Terry Pinkert writes in his book on Hegel's naturalism, there is a strong continuity between animal experience and human experience, in that both have meaningful content within their experience. But there is also a sharp break between animal and human awareness, in that only human can take this content in a fully conceptual way by virtue of a more complicated human form of self-relation as self-consciousness, unquote. So when Hegel talks about the human being as an allgemeine denkende Tier, he grasps at the same time in this formulation both the continuity and discontinuity between the animal and the human. On the one hand, the same kind of relation to a specific inorganic nature or environment is at play, but on the other hand, the boundaries that makes the animal a merely finite being are superseded by the infinite spiritual being of the human being and our ability to think, conceive, imagine, and so on. The human being is an animal, but a thinking animal, his own logikon, and as Hegel say, an amphibian being, living both within nature and within the realm of spirit. And this is precisely why kind of strong reductionist naturalist account of Hegel seems out of the question. The attempt to ground Hegel's system on a kind of strong naturalist approach is bound to collide with Hegel's thesis on the Onmacht der Natur and on the priority he gives to the notion of Geist. Hegel naturalism should rather be understood, I think, in a weak sense, as the attempt to underline that despite its sublation of nature, the ties between nature and spirit are never completely severed through the human being. In other words, it focuses on what remains from nature within itself, by spirit. That is the realist dimension, which is often kind of missed out or neglected in Hegel. But this should not, however, turn out into the opposite, in a kind of apostasy, that in a desperate attempt to actualize a goal style. So, of course, again, this is not uncontroversial, and more should be said on the matter. But I merely wanted to show how, with the notion of unorganische Natur, we have a kind of interesting notion that allows us to make the bridge between animal and human subjectivity, and to consider, even if only to a certain extent, that the human being as a proper natural animal being, allowing for the possibility of a certain naturalist interpretation of ego. And more broadly, and I will conclude on that. Just wanted to outline the full potential of the notion, both in terms of its historical importance, of its ethical implication, and its exegetical interest. Thank you.